Lecture 8, The Springfield Speech, 1857.
Welcome back. At the end of the last lecture, we talked about the Dred Scott decision, which had three principal parts. First, that Dred Scott had no standing to sue in federal court because blacks were not citizens of the United States. Second, that his residence in Illinois did not make him free because when he returned to Missouri, he was subject to the laws there. And third, that his residence in Wisconsin Territory did not make him free because the Missouri Compromise, which had prohibited slavery there, was unconstitutional. I mentioned that this decision would create serious political and rhetorical problems for both Lincoln and Douglas. And it was the last part of the decision that was particularly critical, even though in some respects it was a decision with no practical consequence since the Missouri Compromise already had been repealed. But it challenged directly the premises of both the Republicans and Douglas's political platforms. The Republican platform was based on the assumption that Congress could and should prevent the spread of slavery into new territories. It could do so, it had the legal authority, and it should do so by reinstating the Missouri Compromise and repealing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. On the face of it, the Dred Scott decision knocked that position right out. And so Republicans had to figure out what kind of stance to take in response to that decision. Well, various Republicans said various things, but among them, there are four principal arguments that I can find that stand out. First of all, Republicans said, well, the court has made mistakes before, it's making a mistake now, it can change its mind. And the Republicans said this is a political act, and so a political solution is called for. What's the remedy? Elect a Republican president. The Republican president will appoint Republican members to the Supreme Court. Eventually they'll get a majority, and the Supreme Court will then reverse itself and cancel out the Dred Scott decision. By the way, if any of you feel that ideological considerations governing Supreme Court appointments is a fairly recent origin, this provides clear proof to the contrary. Second, Republicans denied that the Supreme Court had the final authority over the matter. Now, we have pretty much accepted the principle of judicial review, but remember, this is the first time since Marbury versus Madison that the Supreme Court has declared unconstitutional an act of Congress. And in the Marbury versus Madison case, the act that was declared unconstitutional was an act that had given power to the Supreme Court. So the court was denying itself power in that decision. This is the first case, then, of a clearly substantive act of Congress declared unconstitutional. Some Republicans claim the court didn't have the authority to do that. A third Republican response, that was a fairly common one, was to distinguish among the parts of the Dred Scott decision and to say, if Dred Scott has no standing to sue, that's all we need to say. And so the rest of the decision is not legally binding. It is, in the lawyer's phrase, dicta, or opinions of the court, which in one Republican's words are entitled to just as much respect as one would give the assertion of any gentleman in a Washington bar room. In other words, simply to claim that those parts of the decision didn't count. And then the final Republican response was to assert that the Dred Scott decision was proof of a conspiracy to spread slavery all over the country. We'll find Lincoln eventually taking that position, but not just yet. But now, if the Dred Scott decision did damage to the Republican position, it did damage also to the position of Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas, remember, believed in popular sovereignty, that the people who went to a territory to live could decide whether or not slavery would be permitted there. How would they decide? Through the act of their territorial legislature. But what was their territorial legislature? It was a creature of the Congress, because Congress controlled the governments in the territories. And now here was the Supreme Court saying Congress has no power to outlaw slavery in the territories. Well, on the face of it, if Congress has no power to do that, it certainly can't grant to the territorial legislature power to do it. So it seems like the Dred Scott decision not only undercuts the Republican position, it also undercuts popular sovereignty. Or as Lincoln would say the following year in glee, under the Dred Scott decision, squatter sovereignty, which was his name for popular sovereignty, under the Dred Scott decision, squatter sovereignty squatted out of existence. But Douglas obviously couldn't think so and didn't think so. And so in a speech that he delivered in June of 1857, Douglas tried to reconcile the Dred Scott decision with popular sovereignty. He began with a somewhat self-righteous proclamation about the sanctity of Supreme Court decisions. He said, if we don't regard these as final, the only recourse that we have is appeal to mob rule. And of course that's what he's going to try to associate with his opponents. So he defends the decision. He defends the sanctity of court decisions, but he says, in no way does it invalidate popular sovereignty. Why not? Douglas offers two answers. First of all, he says, contrary to what I said a minute ago, the territorial legislature is different from Congress. And this decision applies only to Congress, not to the territorial legislature. So even if Congress can't outlaw slavery in the territories, the legislature out there can. Now this was a position that Lincoln would denounce as sheer sophistry, but Douglas really meant it because he saw the territories not primarily as creatures of Congress, but primarily as incipient states, states in an embryonic condition, if you will. And so his reasoning was that the territorial legislature was analogous to the state government. And as he would say at one point, if the people of Iowa are capable of exercising their judgment in this matter, they don't lose their capability when they move to Nebraska and elect a territorial legislature there. Douglas's second response was somewhat more ingenious. He said, the Supreme Court has decided a question of abstract right, that the slaveholder has an abstract right to take his slave to the territories. True enough. But, he said, that right is barren and worthless unless when the slaveholder gets there, there's legislation to protect him in the exercise of that right. Friendly local legislation, as Douglas put it. And he used an analogy. He said, you may have the right to take your liquor with you to the territory. But if the territory has a Maine law, a prohibition law, your right to take the liquor out there won't do you any good. It's a barren and worthless right. So to make the right meaningful, it depends upon friendly local legislation, which, he said, the territorial legislature was under no obligation to provide. So Dred Scott or no Dred Scott, Douglas believed popular sovereignty was secure, and believing that, he could say as he did that Supreme Court decisions had a sacred character. Well, these points of view Douglas expressed in a speech that he delivered in June in Springfield, Illinois, in the course of which he also made some remarks about the problems in Utah Territory, which was practicing polygamy. Lincoln replied to this speech of Douglas's 2 weeks later, also in Springfield. And Lincoln's Springfield speech of June 1857 is particularly significant, I believe, because it contains, sometimes in embryonic form, almost all of the arguments that Lincoln will use the following year in his campaign against Douglas for the Senate. And it also shows the maturation of Lincoln's thought from the time of the Peoria speech 3 years before. Let's take a look then at that Springfield speech. And as with the Peoria one, I want to go not exactly in order, but I want to highlight the strategic and rhetorical moves that Lincoln is making in this speech. The first of these is that he carefully qualifies his views about equality, and in doing that he denies what both Douglas and the Supreme Court have said about the Declaration of Independence. In the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court had held that the Declaration of Independence did not intend to refer to blacks at all. And the proof of that was, according to the Supreme Court, that the people who signed the Declaration of Independence themselves owned slaves, and they did not move immediately to emancipate them upon signing the Declaration. And so the court reasons, therefore we conclude that this phrase, all men are created equal, does not apply to blacks. This gave Lincoln the opportunity to make clear his view about the Declaration of Independence. And as I read what Lincoln said, notice again a critical distinction that Lincoln makes. He says, I think the authors of that notable instrument intended to include all men, but they did not intend to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say all were equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity. They defined with tolerable distinctness in what respects they did consider all men created equal. Equal in certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This they said, and this meant. Now, what Lincoln is doing here is he's engaging in a rhetorical process called dissociation. He takes the idea of equality, seemingly having one meaning, and divides it into two. He says, in effect, there's equality and then there's equality. There's equality in some respects, and that's not what the Declaration meant. And notice his examples, equal in color, equal in size, things that you couldn't possibly declare people equal in. And then there's other respects, the respects to the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So what Lincoln has done is he said, the fact that the signers of the Declaration did not immediately emancipate their slaves doesn't mean that the Declaration of Independence was not meant to include blacks, and yet at the same time, we shouldn't infer that the Declaration meant to make everybody equal in all respects. As he pointed out, the signers of the Declaration didn't proceed to make all whites equal in all respects either. Moreover, Lincoln said, he had no interest or desire to introduce what he called perfect equality between the races. And it became clear as discussion proceeded that when Lincoln talked about perfect equality between the races, what he meant was intermarriage between blacks and whites. That, after all, would be the logical extension of racial equality. Lincoln denied that he had any such goal, and in fact, he said, what is it that results in the greatest rate of amalgamation between blacks and whites? It's slavery. And he produced statistics to support that, to support the number of mulatto children who were born out of unions between a master and a slave. So, the first thing he does is to deny the Supreme Court's claims about the intent of the founders, so that he can recapture for himself the position that what he supports is consistent with the Founding Fathers. But he does something even beyond that. He takes the goal of equality from the Declaration of Independence and gives it a chronological dimension. So it's not an immediate need or goal or aspiration, but it is an ultimate one, a standard to be held up. And of course, by doing this, he opens a middle space for himself where he does not need to support abolition in order to oppose slavery. He says, they, meaning the signers, meant simply to declare the right so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society, which could be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximate. So the idea behind the pledge of equality in the Declaration is, here is a moral standard that we set up for ourselves, and which we will try to achieve to get progressively closer to. Now, what this enables him to do is also to answer the question, how could the Founding Fathers have opposed slavery and continue to hold slaves? They couldn't figure out what to do in the short run with slavery already among them, because they, like we, couldn't imagine that the races could coexist. So they tolerated it. They put up with it as a necessity, while at the same time they held out the eventual goal of the end of slavery. Lincoln would later argue, by the way, that this is the reason that the word slavery is not mentioned in the Constitution, so that the time would come when it would disappear and it would no longer be a blemish upon the nation. Now, he contrasts this view with the view that Douglas takes of the Declaration of Independence. According to Douglas, the Declaration of Independence is meant only to suggest the equality between the British colonists in North America and between people living in Britain. And so Lincoln can't resist the opportunity, since there have been immigrants from several other nations to Illinois. He can't resist the opportunity to point out why, according to this, not only Negroes, but white people outside of Great Britain and America are not spoken of in that instrument. The French, Germans, and other white people of the world are all gone to pot along with the judge's inferior races. I had thought the Declaration promised something better than the condition of British subjects. But no, it only meant that we should be equal to them in their own oppressed and unequal condition. And so he ridicules Douglas's view of the Declaration of Independence by pointing out how severely limited it is. So what Lincoln has done so far then is he's denied the Supreme Court's claims about the intention of the Founding Fathers, and he's done that by taking the concept of equality and dissociating it, so that he doesn't favor equality in all respects, but in the respects outlined in the Declaration of Independence. And as for when those are to be attained, he regards them not as an immediate pressing necessity, but as a long-term ultimate objective. Now, another thing that he does in the speech is he defends himself against the charge that Douglas has made that by objecting to the Dred Scott decision, he and his fellow Republicans are extremists outside the mainstream who ought to be rejected. Remember, Douglas spoke at some length about the sanctity of a Supreme Court decision, and Lincoln took up this issue. First of all, Douglas had said that Lincoln resisted the Dred Scott decision. Douglas said anything other than acceptance of it is resistance. And once again, Lincoln tries to develop a middle ground. He says, he, meaning Douglas, denounces all who question the correctness of that decision as offering violent resistance to it. But who resists it? Who has, in spite of the decision, declared Dred Scott free and resisted the authority of his master over him? You see what Lincoln is saying? He's saying because he doesn't claim that Dred Scott is free contrary to the Supreme Court, he's not resisting the decision. And he proceeds to suggest that judicial decisions not only decide the case at hand, but offer rules and guidance for judging future cases. And so what he's saying is that while he respects the decision as far as it applies to Dred Scott, he does not regard it as, you'll pardon the phrase, a controlling legal authority. He does not regard it as a precedent binding the judgment of future cases. And this is another way of saying that the only part of the decision that he really regards as binding is the part that says Dred Scott has no standing to sue. Now he suggests that for a Supreme Court decision to have precedent value and to govern other cases, certain conditions must be met. And he sets up the following criteria. He says, if this important decision had been made by the unanimous concurrence of the judges, and without any apparent partisan bias, and in accordance with legal public expectation, and with the steady practice of the departments throughout our history, and had been in no part based on assumed historical facts which are not really true. Or, in wanting some of these, it had been before the court more than once, and had there been affirmed and reaffirmed through a course of years. It then might be, perhaps would be, factious not to acquiesce in it as a precedent. You see what Lincoln has done? He said, if the decision meets this and this and this and this and this and this and this standard, then I'll accept it as a precedent governing future cases. And then he proceeds to argue that the Dred Scott decision is wanting in every one of those criteria. And so that being the case, it's not so impudent of him, he suggests, to object to the decision and say that it ought to be reversed. But that's not resisting the decision, because he doesn't propose to make Dred Scott a slave in spite of the decision. But Lincoln's not done. He proceeds now to have some fun at Douglas's expense, because Douglas has been very sanctimonious about the authority of Supreme Court decisions, and this enables Lincoln to make a point at his expense. He refers back to the presidency of Andrew Jackson, in which the Supreme Court had upheld the constitutionality of the national bank, and Jackson nonetheless had in disregard of that decision, had taken the government's money out of the bank and killed the bank. And so Lincoln says, again and again have I heard Judge Douglas denounce that bank decision and applaud General Jackson for disregarding it. So you see what he's saying? He's saying, Douglas, if you believe that resistance or objection to Supreme Court decisions is a terrible thing, why, look at you. It would be interesting for him to look over his recent speech and see how exactly his fierce philippics against us for resisting Supreme Court decisions fall upon his own head. There is a rhetorical term for this. It's the Latin phrase tu quoque, meaning you're another. You say this about me, well, it also applies to you. And of course, the point of Lincoln making that kind of a statement is to invalidate the criterion that resisting or objecting to Supreme Court decisions is always a bad thing. Moreover, he suggests that Douglas, in saying what he does, is pandering to race prejudice. And he's trying to associate Lincoln with a position that he does not, in fact, support. Lincoln says there is a natural disgust in the minds of nearly all white people to the idea of an indiscriminate amalgamation of the white and black races. And Judge Douglas evidently is basing his chief hope upon the chances of his being able to appropriate the benefit of this disgust to himself. He therefore clings to this hope as a drowning man to the last plank. In other words, you see what he's saying? He's saying Douglas is stereotyping my positions. He's saying that I favor amalgamation and all that, and he's pandering to race prejudice. And Lincoln, in order to separate himself from that view, makes for the first time in this speech a statement that he will make over and over again. And it's again a search for a middle position. He says, I protest against that counterfeit logic which concludes that because I do not want a black woman for a slave, I must necessarily want her for a wife. I need not have her for either. I can just leave her alone. So once again, the fact that Lincoln opposes slavery does not mean that, as Douglas charges, he's an extremist who favors not only resistance to Supreme Court decisions, but amalgamation of the races. So Lincoln so far has suggested that there's a middle ground as far as understanding the view of the Founding Fathers, that equality is an ultimate ideal, and that he's not an extremist. But he's not yet done. Not only does he want to claim he's not an extremist, he wants to claim that Douglas is. That Douglas, in fact, far from being the defender of neutral popular sovereignty, anxiously desires the spread of slavery. And he goes at this in an odd and rather indirect way. I mentioned earlier that in Douglas's Springfield speech, he talked briefly about the state of affairs in Utah Territory. where Douglas was just morally repulsed by the practice of polygamy, so much so that he was arguing that Congress ought to reject and rescind the territorial charter of Utah. That's how much he was upset by the practice of polygamy. Now, Lincoln does something very interesting with this. He doesn't defend polygamy by any means. He has no problem with Congress rescinding Utah's charter over this issue, but notice what it suggests to him about Douglas. Douglas defends popular sovereignty. What is popular sovereignty? It's the right of the people of the territory to regulate their own domestic institutions in their own way. The people of Utah have done that by establishing polygamy, and here's Douglas ready to yank the territorial charter away. What does that prove? Well, to Lincoln, he says this is only additional proof of what was very plain from the beginning, that doctrine, popular sovereignty, was a mere deceitful pretense for the benefit of slavery. If Douglas really meant it when he said the people of the territory can regulate their own institutions, he'd leave Utah alone. The fact that he wants to interfere in Utah means that popular sovereignty is not a neutral principle at all. You recall in the Peoria speech, Lincoln talked about this declared indifference but covert real zeal for the spread of slavery. He's making the same point here, and he's using Douglas's position on Utah to prove it. So Douglas is made out to be an extremist, somebody who wants to see slavery spread to all of the territories, and in fact, Lincoln will later argue, to all of the states. But Douglas is also an extremist, Lincoln claims, because he takes an extreme view of the condition of African Americans. He agrees with the Supreme Court, who had claimed that the condition of the black race is much better in the 1850s than it was at the time of the Declaration. Lincoln, in fact, wants to argue it's just the opposite, that the condition is much worse. And this is consistent with something we've seen Lincoln doing before, arguing that we have degenerated from the time of the Founding Fathers. So listen to what Lincoln says. He says, all the powers of earth seem rapidly combining against him, against the black man. Mammon is after him. Ambition follows. Philosophy follows. And the theology of the day is fast joining the cry. They have him in his prison house. They've searched his person, have left no prying instrument with him. One after another, they've closed the heavy iron doors upon him. And now they have him, as it were, bolted in with a lock of 100 keys, which can never be unlocked without the concurrence of every key. The keys in the hands of 100 different men, and they scattered to 100 different and distant places. That's how much worse off the Negro has become since the time of the Revolution. And Douglas doesn't realize that. And the reason that Douglas doesn't realize it is because Douglas is insensitive to the moral basis for the judgment about slavery. And it's in that insensitivity that distinguishes Douglas from most of his fellow countrymen that Douglas is made out to be an extremist. But this extremism has consequences. It prevents, Lincoln believes, what would be the natural solution to the slavery question, and that is colonization. Because nobody is going to be willing to free his slave and send him back to Africa when the prospect of extending slavery into new territories is much more profitable. As Lincoln puts it toward the end of the speech, the plainest print cannot be read through a gold eagle. It will be ever hard to find many men who will send a slave to Liberia and pay his passage, while they can send him to a new country, Kansas, for instance, and sell him for $1,500. In short, what Douglas is doing is, by his extremist, morally indifferent position, he is closing out the possibility of a practical solution. In the following year, Lincoln will charge that Douglas is actually part of a plan to spread slavery to the states as well as to the territories. So Lincoln, in the Springfield speech, works out the basic elements of the position that he will take all throughout the next year. And in our next lecture, we will begin to see Lincoln espousing that position when we look at one of his most famous speeches, The House Divided.